These are our SD series audio players and the AMP50, which is related to the audio players. They do different things slightly. They share a lot of componentry together, a lot of features together, but they are all slightly different. SD10 is a simple audio player. Use an SD card. You just drag and drop your sound files onto here, shove them in the side. Runs on anything from 9 to 24 volts DC. Has 2 optically isolated trigger inputs if you need to trigger the sounds, or it can just sit there and loop all day long. You can set it to loop continuously. You can also set it to whether it plays back sequentially or at random. So you can have 100 songs on there, 100 pieces of music, and have it play back on its own in sequential or random order. Has a simple line level out, so this gets used a lot of times as a simple replacement for a CD player. You can literally get a card that you can hold months of audio on at standard MP3 data rates. It's very simple. There's no configuration to it at all. You just throw a switch inside, no software configuration that is, and it'll do its thing. Next up is the AMP50. This is a Class D amplifier. Because it's Class D, this little guy is actually, think of it as a great big 1U amplifier inside this box. You notice it has no heat sinks, fans, or fins on it. That's because it's all digital. Basically run your audio in there, has 2 screwdriver adjustments for volume control. Power runs on 12 to 24 volts DC. You can use a plug-in with a 2.1 millimeter plug, or you can hardwire it in through the screw terminals, whichever you prefer. The 2 screw terminals and jack are wired in parallel, so there's no difference between hooking them. And then it's got terminals for your speakers. Very simple. It's a stereo amp, so you can put it out there, pair of wires on each. Typically it's designed for 8 ohm speakers, but you can also bridge the amplifier and use a single 4 ohm speaker if you want. The bridging is a little different than most amps, so take a look in the manual before you actually bridge it. There's also a jumper you need to move inside. This has, other than the volume controls, no adjustments on it whatsoever. And the power on it is, like I said, it's equivalent to a 1U. Typically, a linear amplifier, as has been used for the last 100 years or so, is only about 20% efficient. That's to say that of the electricity you put into the power jack, about 80% of it immediately goes into the heat sink, fan, and waste heat. Only about 20% of the power you put into it actually ends up going out the speaker leads. This amplifier, however, is 90% efficient. It's also not a bad sounding amplifier. It's a 0.1 distortion or lower across most of the power range. Of course, it gets a little bit higher when you get to the very top of the power range, but most of the power range it's 0.1 or lower. So it actually sounds pretty good too. And because it's 90% efficient, it's a 50 watt amplifier, but you need to think of it as a 200 to 250 watt equivalent amplifier. So if this was a linear amplifier, this would be a 200 to 250 watt amplifier as far as the power output on the thing. This unit is the SD25. This basically takes both these units, the SD10 audio player with an SD card and the amplifier, and puts it into one case. So it's an audio player. You drag and drop your sound files onto here. You have most modes you can do 256 sound files in it. There are other modes that will allow, if you're just going to have it play sounds randomly or just continuously play, you can put up to 32,000 sound files on here. Your only limitation is the size of the card you stick in the side, the SD card. It has also a mixer input that allows you to actually bring in a microphone or an external audio source. There's application notes in the manual if you download that from the website as far as how you hook a microphone. So you can hook up a microphone, hook the push-to-talk button into the A or the B input so that it actually ramps the audio that's playing off the card down, allows you to do a talk over on it. Very simply, it's literally a microphone preamp going into here and the push-to-talk button. Connections are very similar. You've got your power jack there, 2.1 millimeter, hooked in parallel to the power screw terminals here. You can run it into either one, doesn't matter. 4 terminals for speakers. Again, it's a stereo player. It's got LED modulation lights, so you can actually see when it's modulating things. Has a status output, which is an uncommitted transistor. It's opto-isolated from the circuitry inside, so you can run a LED or a solid-state relay or something off that. It goes active when the card is playing a foreground sound. Then it has the A and B inputs for triggering sounds. This one has about just shy of 30 modes of different operation, selected with a dip switch inside. It can just loop continuously. As soon as it powers up, it'll start playing. You can set up the inputs here to where they duck the audio down. You can even set the rate of duck from immediate to 2 or 3 seconds, I think is the maximum on there. We'll even do playlisting. So say if you have 100 sounds on here, Input A would trigger sounds 1 through 50. Input B would trigger sounds 51 through 100. So you can have, say, a bilingual with multiple sounds on there. So one does, say, the English one, and the second one does the French one, or Spanish, or whatever the secondary language is. Also has modes for storecasting, where you put a bunch of sound files on there. It plays track 1, which would be your store advertising, your in-store advertising, or even something as simple as the white zone is for loading and unloading only. And then it plays one of the other tracks. When it finishes playing the other track, it then plays track 1 again. The white zone is for loading, or your advertising message, or your phone on hold message, whatever you need. And then it goes back and plays that. So it just basically alternates between track 1 and all the other ones. And again, you can set up the other tracks to play either sequentially or randomly. The big brother is this guy right here. This is the SD50. This happens to be an SD5040. The equivalent of 2 of these amplifiers. So this has an equivalent of it's a 100 watt Class D amplifier. So it's equivalent to about a 400 to 500 watt linear amplifiers inside this box. These units are available in a SD50 which is audio only, doesn't have any show control or DMX or anything else. The SD58 and the SD5040. The 8 has 8 animation outputs. The 40 has 40 animation outputs. These are sort of the all-in-one units. They have the audio playback from an SD card again. Shove the card inside, it'll play them back. It also has show control that can synchronize and control that. So you can play back synchronized output on the animation outputs, also DMX 512. It'll do a full universe, which is 512 channels, of DMX 512 synchronized to the audio. It also has a real-time clock built in, so you can actually do a 365-day schedule. You can set that on July 4th at noon, it will play this show. So you can actually set it up a year in advance, every show that it'll play. Typically, you set those up by weekday, so you don't actually have to go out and adjust it every 6 months or 12 months. So it even has an atomic clock input on the thing. So if you want, you can actually synchronize this to the GPS satellites overhead. If it does that, then this unit would be synchronized with every other unit that is also listening to the GPS satellites to within 1,000th of a second. That can be used in a case where you have multiple systems that have to synchronize with one another, but you can't physically connect them. So we've had cases where someone was doing a fountain across 4 corners of an intersection, and they needed to synchronize the 4 fountains. And they played music and did all that other good stuff. So they looked at the cost of running a conduit underneath this intersection. It was quite a bit of money. Plus they'd have to close the roads and all that to dig a ditch. And what they found is they could just add the GPS antenna to each of these for a relatively small sum, and they all synchronized nicely. We have other ones where they're running parade floats that, the parades run down the street and the background sound plays, which has the background beat tracks, and the foreground tracks are played off these guys, and they're all in sync and just works perfectly. So again, real-time clock, DMX 512 input or output, show control, everything else basically all in one.